I knew something was off when my badge stopped working, but only at the espresso bar. Not the front door, not the finance floor, just the espresso bar. The system that let you grab a cappuccino without swiping, the one I built to integrate usage metrics with morale data, just blinked red and beeped like I was some intern trying to cheat the foam rations. I stood there, sleeve rolled up, badge pressed firm, the machine whining its little protest, and Mark Essler standing 3 feet away pretending not to watch. I saw the twitch of his lip. The same smug, half-swallowed smirk he wore every time someone older than him opened their mouth. Like we were all relics of a time before agile meant something and before deck slides had to come with color-coded vibes. That moment, the espresso bar denial, was the first shot. It sounds dumb. But when you've spent 11 years building the backbone of a company's financial infrastructure, and suddenly you're denied caffeine by your own code, it's not just a glitch. It's a message. And hey, if you're listening to this story and you've made it this far, do me one favor. Subscribe and tap that like button. I know 97% of folks never do, but it really helps the team keep digging up stories like this. We're just getting warmed up. Back to Mark, fresh off his Ivy League throne, paraded into the Calatin Group as our new VP of strategy like some fintech messiah in a blazer that cost more than my entire monthly grocery haul. He showed up with his air-purified water bottle and his disdain for legacy systems. You know who the legacy was? Me and my team. We weren't flashy. We weren't loud. We were precise, efficient, quietly terrifying in how deeply embedded we were into Calatin's core financials. But to Mark, we were clutter, a spreadsheet graveyard with faces. And he was here to modernize. He started small, renamed folders, deleted the shortcut icons we'd used for years, forced everyone onto his god-awful shared dashboard that broke if you used the back button too fast. Then he started talking about velocity, speed, lean modeling, all while tossing out terms like disruptive analytics that meant nothing to people who actually moved real capital instead of just pitching it. I stayed quiet. Let the wave roll through. I'd seen this type before. Every 3 to 5 years, someone like him gets hired to shake things up. Most of them flame out, leave behind a mess, and vanish into a VC firm where buzzwords pay the bills. But Mark was different. He didn't just want to shake things, he wanted to erase everything that existed before him and stamp his initials on the ashes. The thing he didn't understand, because men like Mark never understand, is that the bones of Calatin weren't in his PowerPoint decks. They were in the crawl spaces, the automation scripts, the silent validation logic no one even knew existed because we'd made them seamless. They were in me. I'd spent the past year refining the forecasting model that handled Calaton's financial projections, not just for quarterly reports, but for internal caps, executive bonuses, vendor triggers. It was the engine underneath their shiny revenue graphics. Nobody outside our team really got it, but they trusted it because it worked. Clean, fast, auditable. Except Mark didn't care about that. He wanted speed. Perception, he said once in a meeting, is precision. So when the variance reports started coming in faster than expected, I knew something was broken or tampered with. At first, I thought maybe someone in analytics was running tests without flags. But then I saw it. Someone had overridden the validation timing triggers. Reports were being approved before all inputs stabilized. That's like baking a cake with a preheated oven that never actually got hot. You might pull it out looking done, but inside, goo. I flagged it. Sent a quiet message to internal QA. 2 days later, the QA analyst, Beth, sharp as a tack, got reassigned to ESG metrics. No response to my ticket, no update, just poof, gone. That's when I knew it wasn't a mistake. The next day, Mark caught me by the elevator and said, "You're slowing us down." Just like that. No context, no preamble. I looked him in the eye and said, "Accuracy takes time." He laughed. Actually laughed. "Speed is key," he said, stepping into the elevator. "The board wants faster results." I didn't respond. I just watched the doors close. What he didn't know, what nobody knew, was that while he was out there talking velocity, I still held the keys to the system underneath. The legacy system he thought we'd abandoned, it wasn't dead. It just ran quiet. Through back-end license authentication tools, nobody but me and the original architects understood. I hadn't shut it off. I'd layered it, like bone under scar tissue. The projections they used still passed through it. still required silent handshake tokens buried in the code, tokens only I could generate, tokens that were bound to my employment ID. And Mark? He'd just declared war on a system he didn't even realize he was still using. The first report came in on December 3rd. Early. Too early. It was a variant summary, red flagged for review, but the triggers were off. I designed the cycle to only release those summaries after 3 layers of reconciliation: intra-quarter benchmarks, external vendor inputs, and capital risk buffer updates. This one had none of those. It was like someone had just pressed send on a half-baked model and called it analysis. That shouldn't have been possible. I checked the log. The report was routed through a temporary macro, one I hadn't authorized. I ran a trace. It was short, ugly, and inserted directly into a master sheet that hadn't been touched in over a year. It bypassed my architecture entirely and forced approval with manual inputs. Manual. As in, someone eyeballed a number and typed it in. No checks. No balance sheets. No audit trail. At first, I assumed incompetence. Maybe a junior analyst had copied a deprecated sheet. Maybe someone fat-fingered the wrong template. But then I saw the commit metadata. It was Mark. Or, more precisely, someone under Mark's account. The initials matched an external contractor I'd seen loitering in the break room the week prior, wearing Yeezys and talking about streamlining back-end bloat. He'd probably been paid more for 1 week than I made in a quarter. I flagged the macro with a request for review and sent it through the standard compliance channel. No reply, not even a bounce back, just silence. 3 hours later, my access to the dev sandbox was downgraded to read-only. No notice, no explanation. That afternoon, I passed Mark in the hallway. He was holding court near the product display, talking to some investor tour like he'd invented data modeling in his dorm room. When he saw me, he gave me that look again, that condescending, "Oh, you still work here?" smirk. "You sent a variance summary with manual inputs," I said flatly. He didn't flinch. "Speed is key," he said. "The board wants faster results." I tilted my head. "Did you run it through the license gateway?" That wiped the smirk for a second. "We're not using your old system anymore," he said. "The dashboard's been rebuilt." I nodded once. "Good luck with that." He walked away like he'd just checkmated me. But here's the thing. He hadn't. Not even close. See, the system Mark thought he replaced wasn't actually replaceable. The models might have been migrated, sure, but the validation architecture, the real brains of the operation, was layered underneath everything they were still using. Because nobody in their right mind writes forecasting logic without chaining it to a secure license vault, and nobody except me ever had the master key to that vault. Not IT, not Mark, not the shiny contractor in Yeezys. That key sat buried in a validation chain that tracked every report triggered post-compile, pinged an authentication server I maintained offsite, and returned one of 2 things, a passcode or a silent flag. They never noticed the flags, because they didn't look. Because people like Mark never look. They assume the new code works just because it runs. And what they didn't realize, what no one in that sleek glass building ever thought to question, was that every unauthorized trigger silently recorded its origin, not just who ran it, but when, where, and with what credentials. And once my employment credentials were revoked, once I was let go, those flags would change. They wouldn't just log violations. They'd start calculating penalties. Back in December, I didn't know exactly when it would happen, but I knew this. The moment they touched that forecasting engine without the proper keys, the moment Mark's fast results started pushing real dollars around, the trap would spring. Quietly, mathematically, irrevocably. And the best part? They wrote the check themselves. I just built the printer. It happened at 11:57 p.m. on New Year's Eve. I was home, watching the ball drop on mute, sipping cheap bourbon out of a chipped mug because I couldn't be bothered to pour it properly. My cat, Moxie, was asleep on a tax folder. My phone buzzed. Just once. One subject line. Contract termination, performance-based. No call, no email body, no HR formality, not even a time-stamped signature. Just that line, from a no-reply address dumped into my inbox like trash. 4 minutes before midnight. 4 minutes before a fiscal year ended and the Q4 bonus cycle locked in. Mark always had a flair for the theatrical. Guess he thought it would be clever. Cut the legacy clutter loose before the new year. Clean break. New era. Streamlined projections, tighter margins. Probably toasted himself with some imported gin, patted his contractor on the back, and made a mental note to update his LinkedIn with another buzzword. I stared at that email for 10 seconds. Then I opened my laptop. It booted slow. I didn't rush. I already knew what I'd find. At exactly 12:01 a.m., the Calatin Group's Q4 report went live, auto-scheduled as it always had been, tied to a sequence trigger in the server logs. I clicked into the dashboard. Navigation felt different, like they'd changed the UI font to make it look modern. But underneath, it was still my bones, my work, my code, my license structure, and in the deferred liabilities column in soft gray text, there it was. 4,242 then 176 license obligation, terminated employee access. They'd activated it. I closed the laptop and leaned back. The clause had been in place for 3 years. Clause 16B, buried deep inside a legacy vendor agreement I personally architected during a structural overhaul back in 2020. It didn't sound exciting then, just a standard indemnity trigger for unauthorized post-employment usage of proprietary forecasting frameworks. But over the years, as we refined and upgraded, that clause evolved. Quietly, elegantly, it became a living switch tied not to the server logs, but to the timing of license detachment. See, if you terminated a license after a report had already compiled, but before the cycle finalized, the liability clock started ticking. The system couldn't stop the report, but it would count it, and then it would invoice, automatically, dynamically, in perpetuity. Mark's team didn't revoke the license before triggering the bonus cycle. They didn't even check, because they didn't know where to look, because they never bothered to ask. I sipped my bourbon. Somewhere, probably in an overpriced condo overlooking the river, Mark was celebrating. Maybe he was telling someone how he'd cleaned house before the fiscal reset. Maybe he was gloating to the board in a private Slack channel. Maybe he was already sketching out a press release about Calaton's new direction. Didn't matter, because that $4.8 million, it was already ticking, and it wasn't a lawsuit. It wasn't a severance negotiation. It was a line item, one their own system generated, one tied to an internal execution framework no one on his team understood, one that couldn't be deleted or reversed without flagging an audit trail that went straight to the SEC. And the best part? It wasn't even malicious. I didn't hack anything. I didn't sneak in or rewrite code. I just let the machine do what it was built to do, account for risk, penalize abuse, validate authorship. They thought firing me at 11:57 p.m. was a power move. They thought cutting me loose right before the quarter closed would save them money. They didn't know they were pressing a trigger. They didn't know the report they scheduled at 12:01 would be their confession. And they sure as hell didn't know the name under license architect would reappear, right next to the debt. The bonus macros were Mark's pride and joy. I'd heard him brag about them in the hallway, in meetings, even at that idiotic velocity lunch he hosted for the board where they served salad in mason jars and called it disruptive. We've cut bonus processing from 5 days to 3 hours, he'd boasted, grinning like he'd just reinvented compound interest. What he didn't say, because he didn't know, was that his precious speed came at a cost. He'd gutted the validation layer. The macros skipped verification entirely. No dual authentication, no license ping, just raw, unsanctioned execution. That was the flaw. Clause 16B wasn't flashy. It wasn't even recent. It sat there in the agreement like a landmine buried under a marble floor. The clause read plainly, any financial forecast executed post-termination utilizing the protected model framework shall reclassify derivative outputs as third-party license obligations, calculated dynamically per usage. Legal speak, sure, but its meaning was clear. If they fired me and used my system afterward, all gains tied to those executions became my fee. And they had. At 12:01 a.m. on January 1st, the company had auto-published Q4 bonus reports using my exact forecasting scaffold, still bound to my license ID, which, due to their rush, had not been officially revoked. In the eyes of the system, the report had no authorization, but the math didn't stop. It just changed who got paid. Mark's team didn't understand how deep the framework ran. They assumed the UI was the system. That, because they slapped a new dashboard skin over it, they had ownership. But behind every button they clicked, behind every bonus report they pushed, there was a heartbeat that still pulsed with my credentials. Not overtly, nothing obvious, just a string of silent authentication keys tied to execution tokens. And the moment those tokens detected post-termination use, the license switched modes. Not denial, not shutdown. That would have been easy to fix. No, Clause 16b reclassified from internal to external, from $0 operation to fee-based execution. The fee structure was progressive, tiered, a percentage of each bonus dollar calculated against the projected variance envelope of the quarter. That's a fancy way of saying, the more they paid out using my system, the more it owed me. And because Q4 was Calaton's biggest quarter, the holiday bump, year-end gains, stock adjustment, the system logged millions, quietly, automatically. Somewhere, probably while Mark was doing shots of overpriced whiskey, the first invoice generated. Not an email, not a PDF. A ledger item, posted internally, time-stamped, and routed to the accounts payable queue under IP license obligation, external entity, NovaVest Solutions. My firm, registered, auditable, fully compliant. They hadn't seen it yet. Probably wouldn't for a few more days. But it was there, and growing. Every single bonus dollar they greenlit, every variance summary that sailed through without validation, every streamlined decision Mark made, all of it was now bound to a debt he didn't know he owed. I didn't say a word, didn't send an alert. I let the clock run. Because Clause 16b wasn't just a trigger, it was a loop. A recursive function that tallied and adjusted and waited. The system would keep calculating fees on every new usage until someone manually shut it off with the right credentials. Credentials that had been wiped when they terminated me. So unless Mark figured out a way to back out an active Q4 cycle and survive the compliance fallout from tampering with an auditable financial report, he was stuck. And me? I was free. No login, no backdoor, no hacks, just a clause they forgot to read, in a system they never truly owned. Monday morning came with all the subtlety of a car alarm in a funeral home. From what I later heard, through a series of tight-lipped ex-colleagues and a forwarded screenshot or two, legal went into full scramble mode by 8:42 a.m. The CFO had noticed a red flag on the Q4 bonus ledger during her morning review, something about external license obligations not reconciled. She clicked it, read the ledger entry, froze. Within minutes, she'd looped in compliance, legal, and someone from risk who hadn't slept since the 29th. Mark, true to form, was nowhere to be found. He'd booked PTO for January 2nd and 3rd, said he needed time to decompress after restructuring, which meant the people cleaning up his mess were the very teams he'd bulldozed through all December. That's when they opened the original agreement. Not the pretty onboarding doc in HR's SharePoint folder, the real one. The thick, version-controlled, footnoted contract stored in legal's private archive with retention rights tied to tiered licensing frameworks. The file was 6 years old, signed twice. Once when I first deployed the model, and again when we expanded its forecasting branch during the pandemic volatility crunch. They read it, slowly, probably out loud. Clause 16b wasn't just in there, it was highlighted. And right below it, license revocation must be jointly confirmed in writing by model architect and legal representative. Absent mutual sign-off, license is deemed active and proprietary. That was it. The trap wasn't hidden, it wasn't even buried. It was sitting in plain daylight waiting. All they had to do was issue the revocation properly, have legal contact me, sign the mutual release, and initiate the termination protocol. But Mark didn't do that. He didn't even know it existed. He'd assumed, like so many others, that when you fire someone, their work disappears too. Instead, what he'd done was terminate the architect while keeping the machine. And the machine, my system, didn't stop. It just shifted into external audit mode. Every single action taken through the model after 11:59 p.m. on December 31st was now unauthorized use. Every forecast, every bonus calculation, every output that touched the board summary or the investor prep deck. Flagged, logged, tied to my license. To make it worse, they had used that data. It wasn't just test runs or ghost entries, it was distributed, uploaded to investor portals, used for internal bonus allocation, shown to department leads during kickoff calls. Their entire Q4 financial architecture was built on top of outputs they didn't have rights to use. The legal term for that? Breach. The operational term? Panic. I wasn't there, but I can picture it. Paralegals digging through time-stamped emails, compliance analysts reviewing system logs frame by frame, some poor junior associate tasked with finding a copy of the mutual revocation, only to realize it never existed. Because Mark never filed it. Because Mark never thought he had to, I could feel the wave of it from my kitchen table. That slow, dawning horror when people realized the thing they dismissed as legacy clutter wasn't clutter at all. It was live, intelligent, contractually armed, and now, every hour that passed without resolution was racking up fees. This wasn't just negligence, it was arrogance, the kind that comes wrapped in lanyards and buzzwords and MBA case study bravado, the kind that skips over details because details are someone else's job, the kind that gets you sued 6 ways from Sunday. Except I wasn't suing them. Not yet. I didn't need to. The system was doing it for me, in real time, with precision, and without mercy, all because they didn't update a file, didn't read a clause, didn't think the woman behind the curtain might have planned for exactly this, because they never asked themselves the one question that really mattered. What if she saw this coming? It started with a missed refresh. On January 5th, Calaton's investor portal, normally synced every morning like clockwork, went dark. No new data. No dashboard summary, no variance charts, just a stale Q4 snapshot with a tiny spinning wheel in the top right corner, forever promising update in progress. Problem was, investors were expecting answers, especially after Mark's breathless holiday letter hinted at record-setting bonus alignment and accelerated capital optimization. Behind that frozen wheel was a larger failure. Their automated report generation pipeline had crashed. Not all at once, but piece by piece, like a house wired backwards. The capital allocation tables started throwing errors first, values not aligning with forecast benchmarks. Then, the variance summaries refused to publish. Reconciliation scripts flagged missing inputs. Eventually, the dashboard refused to generate at all. At first, they blamed IT, then they blamed the cloud provider. But the logs told a different story. The system wasn't malfunctioning. It was rejecting unauthorized architecture. The root directory had switched classification from internal legacy to external licensed on January 1st at 12:01 a.m. Per clause, 16b. Every script dependent on that path was now gated behind an access wall, and that wall belonged to me. Across town, my consultancy, Nova Vest Solutions, filed a Form ID and accompanying rights claim with the SEC. The wording was precise. Surgical. Unpaid license obligations for proprietary forecasting model utilized without authorization during Q4 reporting cycle. Attached. Audit logs, execution timestamps, and a notarized copy of the original agreement with the embedded clause. We didn't accuse, we didn't demand. We just documented. And the SEC, they don't like unverified math, especially when public filings are involved. By January 7th, Calaton's Q4 report was flagged in the regulatory review system. A quiet note tucked in the back-end index read, "Inputs unverified, potential breach of license integrity, forecasts derived from revoked architecture." It wasn't a scandal. Not yet. But in the world of investor confidence, it didn't need to be loud. A whisper was enough. The dashboard stopped loading. The phone calls started. Capital partners wanted explanations. Institutional investors demanded technical reviews. One private equity group requested a full model traceback, citing concerns over license authenticity. Behind closed doors, the panic was volcanic. They couldn't fix it. Not without admitting they'd built their entire Q4 distribution on data they no longer owned. Not without rewriting the reports, recalculating bonus structures, and notifying the board that the record-setting numbers were now legally contaminated. And then came the tipping point. Nova Vest's claim triggered a secondary compliance ping, one tied to an internal watchdog clause buried in a partner agreement Calaton had with Harrow Ventures. That clause required immediate disclosure of any data irregularity affecting reported earnings. Harrow's legal team saw the SEC note, cross-checked timestamps, and did what any self-preserving investor would do. They froze movement. No new capital infusions. No expansion approvals. No disbursement of executive bonuses. Everything paused. And all of it stemmed from a single oversight. A single failure to revoke a license properly. A single assumption that the system would just forget the architect once she was gone. But I didn't leave quietly. I left methodically. The architecture didn't forget me. It recognized the breach. It documented every flag. And now, it had spoken to the one entity more terrifying than legal or the board, the market. And the market doesn't do forgiveness. It does risk. And Calaton had just become radioactive. The first email came at 6:12 a.m. from someone in procurement I barely remembered. Just 2 words in the subject line. We need. No greeting, no apology, no acknowledgement of the midnight termination or the weeks of silence that followed. Just a desperate, silent scream behind those 2 words, asking me to clean up the mess they swore wasn't mine anymore. I didn't answer. By noon, 3 more followed. One from IT, one from an analytics director I hadn't spoken to in months, and one from Mark himself, masked behind a corporate alias but still unmistakably his tone, passive, urgent, and laced with entitlement. If you could help us resolve some irregularities, he wrote, we'd appreciate it. No mention of firing me, no mention of the clause. Just a faint trail of breadcrumbs leading toward the hole they'd dug themselves into. I didn't respond to that either. Instead, my attorney forwarded a 7-page technical breakdown to Calaton's general counsel, titled Active Utility Dependencies, Nova Vest Authenticated Systems. It listed 11 live modules, still running, still functional, each one tied to my original license key and embedded with active audit logs. These weren't minor scripts or forgotten subroutines. They were critical. Model, ReconX, variance reconciliation. Engine, live. Yield cap snap, capital flow snapshot, live. Bonus align, V4, Q4 incentive calculation, live. Vendor sweep, payment tracker for high volume contracts, live. Tax delta, regional discrepancy adjuster, live. And 6 more just like them, all buried deep in Calaton's infrastructure, quietly humming along, processing millions of dollars in transactions. Each utility had its own logging stream. Each one stamped every execution with a traceable key, and each key was linked directly to me, legally, contractually, and irrevocably. No one at Calaton had disabled them. No one had rebuilt them. They were still depending on them, even after they fired the person who built the fuse box. The penalties, already accruing. My license structure was designed to escalate, each unapproved execution added to the liability total, slowly, mathematically, without sentiment. And by January 10th, the total crossed $4.8 million. That's when the email from Harrow Ventures landed in Calaton's board inbox. It was a single line. Did you just run 4.8 matters of flagged models? That line didn't come from legal. It didn't come from a junior analyst or a compliance intern. It came from a senior partner, someone whose name alone could send ripples through quarterly strategy decks. And what he was really asking wasn't about models. He was asking, are we exposed? Because if Calaton had knowingly used unauthorized systems after termination, and those systems were tied to public filings, then it wasn't just a license dispute anymore. It was a governance issue, a fiduciary risk, a possible breach of investor trust. And worse, there was a paper trail. The logs were live. The license key was time-stamped. The filing was documented. The clause had been submitted, and the red flags had all been visible to anyone who'd bothered to read. But they hadn't. Mark hadn't. Legal hadn't. The board hadn't. Now they all had. And silence was no longer an option. The CFO called for an emergency meeting. Legal whispered about early settlements. PR began drafting clarification memos. But it was too late for control. The story wasn't being told by them anymore. It was being told by math. And math, when wounded, doesn't scream. It invoices. The room was already full by 9:13, no pastries, no coffee, just a thick heat of tension that made the glass conference doors fog up from the inside. The lights were too bright, the air too still, and for once, no one was pretending this was just another weekly sync. The CFO stood at the head of the table, not behind it, not seated, standing, shoulders squared, jaw locked. I wasn't there, obviously, but I'd seen her in that stance before. She saved it for two occasions. Audit season and bloodlettings she didn't open with pleasantries. "Let's begin," she said, flipping the binder in front of her. "As of this morning, we are carrying an unreconciled liability of $4.87 million tied directly to our Q4 compensation infrastructure." No one moved. The head of compliance, a man whose tie was always a half-inch too tight, cleared his throat. "The issue," he began, tapping his tablet, "stems from execution paths inside the forecast pipeline. Bonus calculations post-termination were processed using unauthorized architecture. That architecture was bound to a protected license agreement. Per Clause 16b, each execution qualifies as a separate breach, and the system has categorized the total as intellectual property debt." Silence. Someone shifted in a chair. A hand reached for a pen and stopped halfway. Then Mark, sitting 2 seats from the CFO, leaned forward with that exact tone of condescension that got him hired in the first place. "It's just code," he said, shrugging. "We refactored half of it. The output was ours." The CFO didn't blink. "No," she said, "it was never yours. You didn't own the logic. You didn't own the validation chain. You didn't even know where the license check was embedded. You stripped out the front end and thought that changed the contract. But we rebuilt it. You skinned it," she snapped, voice sharpening now. "That model was protected. That protection was tied to employment status. That status was revoked at 11:57 p.m. on December 31st. The report triggered at 12:01. The system logged every step. And then it billed us." Mark's face paled, like the blood just gave up and left. "The logs were internal," he muttered weakly. "No one was supposed to see them." She turned a page, held up a printout of the SEC filing. "Nova Vest saw them. Harrow saw them. Now the SEC sees them. And soon, every investor we briefed with that report will see them too." Another compliance officer spoke up, this one from internal risk. "We have no clean rollback path," he said. "Revoking the data now triggers a red line on all associated Q4 actions. We'd have to recalculate payouts, investor summaries, maybe even restate filings." Mark's voice cracked. "That's insane. It's over a clause." The CFO turned to him, calm and final. "It's not just a clause. It's the clause. The one you skipped. The one you should have flagged before rushing in termination to make your bonus metrics look clean." He tried to speak. She raised her hand. "You're done." That was it. No vote, no debate, just 3 words, like a switch being flipped. The room exhaled. A few chairs shifted back, slow and careful, like they didn't want to spook the moment. Mark sat frozen, eyes flicking to the exit like he'd only just realized the walls were glass and everyone outside could see the fallout. But it didn't matter who watched, because the real damage wasn't in this room. It was already on the filings, on the investor dashboards, in the compliance queue, and the woman they fired without a phone call? She wasn't in the room either. She was on the ledger. And that's where it counted. The revision came without fanfare. No press release, no executive interview, no performative LinkedIn post about lessons learned or the importance of diligence in a fast-paced environment. Just a quiet little update in Calaton Group's amended Q4 disclosure, filed with the SEC on January 26. Line 17, subsection B, new entry. IP license obligation settlement, $4,971,328 for a year. No footnote, no apology, just a number, a settlement, a reckoning, dressed in ledger language and buried between investor options and capital accrual forecasts. It wasn't marked as a bonus, not severance. It wasn't even filed under personnel. It lived under liabilities, right where it belonged. And me? I was on my second cup of coffee in the Nova Vest office, a 1-floor suite with thrifted desks, 0 views, and a server cabinet that hummed like it knew it had a future. I read the filing once, smiled without showing teeth, and closed the tab. No announcement, no revenge tweet, no passive-aggressive email signature updates. I didn't need to say a thing. 2 weeks later, Nova Vest onboarded its first public client, a regional credit union consolidating its risk modeling after a merger. Small win, some would say, but it meant everything. They wanted clean data, real projections, verified architecture. I gave them that. And in the footer of the final integration report, right aligned in soft slate font, sat one line I didn't ask to include. My team did it on their own. Architected by the one they fired. It wasn't spiteful. It wasn't bitter. It was just true. Mark, as far as I know, didn't land anywhere loud. His name disappeared from Calatin's website sometime in early February. His replacement, a woman from compliance with a background in actual systems engineering, began issuing new internal policies, each one echoing language from the very agreement they tried to bury. I didn't respond when former colleagues reached out. I didn't rub it in, because some endings don't need fire. Sometimes all it takes is one quiet line on a balance sheet and a model that still works, long after the people who dismissed it are gone.